Okay, we are live talking about
The long game.
the long game.
How did I know that the title was going to slip your mind?
Because I'm half dead all the time.
This is another one, kind of like The Unquiet Dead, where it's like if someone was like, just give me the highlight of Series 1, I'd say you could skip this one. Like, they established Satellite 5, and that's the location for the finale, but outside of that, I don't think too much meaningful happens in this episode. Getting details despite having just watched it, I could be wrong.
It's a shame that Russell T Davies posthumously made this episode very relevant to the end of the series, because otherwise there's not much else to it.
I don't know if posthumously is the word you want to use, because that makes it sound like Russell T Davies just died.
That's fair.
I don't think this episode is really that bad.
Me either. It's not really like noteworthy at all, I don't think. There's nothing overly bad or good about it.
Not bad, but it's more just kind of average. I'd rather it be bad, just so we could spend more time tearing it apart. Not much to talk about, really. I mean,
I do like the political message of it, like going into like the news and journalism and stuff like that. That's the one thing it does stick out to me that makes it kind of worth watching.
I think it's one of those things as well where people really overestimate just how politically motivated a lot of Russell T Davies stories could be. I think this one is based more specifically because around time there was a huge controversy with the Labour leader, Tony Blair, and him going into the whole invasion of Iraq. I won't go into too much detail with this because it's complicated and it's messy and there's ramifications going on.
I mean, they already did that with Aliens of London,
where
the Slytherin were clearly a parody of the basically politicians.
This is more looking at the media's complicity of it, because that was a huge talking point at the time. A lot of papers which were pro-Blair were kind of scrutinized at the time, and the idea of the media manipulating you into fear and stuff, that stuff is really interesting. It's a pity the story doesn't do anything that great with it. Like, the base idea is good. The media uses fear to control people. It doesn't really do it in a way that's engaging. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, I think this is really early in the show as well, so we didn't really have to pick out, like, is this a show? What kind of demographic are we going for? Is this like one for kids where we're being very broad? You know, usually with Doctor Who, it can usually say something a little bit more interesting with the points it hits, whereas this is just media manipulates people to fear, and
they don't really touch on what they're even manipulating the people to actually believe. It's just like a random message of
randomly. Yeah, I think it's both better and worse than you guys are giving it credit for. Well, like, first of all, this episode just keeps coming up when we do these, but what it reminds me most of, the way we talk about it, is Kerblam, where it's like we've got a really interesting potential like political commentary and like in the world building, and what we could maybe have benefited from is just more time spent in the setting.
Kerblam at least tried to do some things with the premise, whereas the long game, I believe, just sort of just coasts on it, where it's just like, media bad, and that's basically all we're going to say here.
But the problem with Kerblam, it just ends up on a really bad messaging of capitalism can keep going, and we should keep it going in some way. At least it doesn't have a bad message, I will say that.
At least with Kerblam, which I don't like that episode, but I felt this point was a bit more observant and a bit more trying to get at a bigger point. Whereas this one, like I said, it's just media is bad because it instills fear into people. And like Rob says, there's no real specific thing that they're putting fear into people outside of to make some weird immigration parallel with the lack of aliens. It's very undercooked.
See, this is what I mean. I think this is sort of oversimplifying, which for one, like to keep with the Kerblam comparison, I think where Kerblam gets it better, even if it's not like intentional, is that Kerblam has like two underlying messages and one of them really gets shafted for the sake of the other. So like Kerblam is on the one hand about capitalism, and the capitalistic messaging gets really bad because it decides to focus on the other half of the messaging, which is like technophobia and not being wary all the time of the advancement of technology. This episode has like a lot of things that it's talking about, and it just kind of doesn't have enough time for any of them. So like with Kathika, we've got sort of like the need for upward mobility and like people who are trying to advance beyond like their position and beyond their class, and how that in and of itself is the people who are in a higher position to them, like taking advantage of that. Where we've got that bit from the editor who's like, yeah, we've got people all the time who we bring up here because they're so desperate to get like a better, like more prestigious position. And like we prey on that and we keep that rumor of like the walls are made of gold because people are willing to do anything if it's for their own advancement. And that's interesting. And like you guys keep bringing up fear. I don't think this episode is really saying anything about the media and fear at all. What they're basically saying is that the media can be used to manipulate people into like being slaves, basically. Where the doctor is like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, society has been stalled by like 90 years. They stop human progress for multiple generations. And again, with the capitalism thing, the main motivation behind it isn't fear. Like everything in series 1, it's about the money, where it's like the money will keep going and we need this satellite to keep running. The reason that keeps Satellite 5 going is because Max, the big pink blob thing, has decided that this is where it's going to live, and we need to constantly generate heat in order to keep it alive. So everything that happens on this satellite is in service of keeping Max alive, and in order to make that work, we need people to constantly be working. And how do we do that? We like get them into the right mindset to just do whatever we tell them by controlling the media. So they basically kill two birds with one stone. If we have everyone on Satellite 5 working on creating the news, then we get to control the news. And by doing that, we get to tell people that what they need to do is keep working. And we just keep that cycle going, and that'll keep Max alive and like fed forever. So that's interesting. The problem is, and why I don't blame either of you guys for sort of like reading different things into it, is that all of that stuff comes and goes pretty fast. We're juggling too many things. I don't think this episode had enough time, and the dialogue is a little more vague than it like could benefit to be, I think. So the ideas don't really have room to breathe.
And I think that's part of the issue as well, is that these ideas are really interesting. The idea that the media controls people to do what they may not naturally do, which is extremely and rather creepily reminiscent of modern day political discussion. But as you said, it's very vague and it's very undercooked. Maybe it's just from my own background, from studying media and doing having a degree in journalism and stuff. I tend to be very gun shy about really terrible commentary on journalism, because they tend to give it way more power. Media has a lot of influence and power over people, but they tend to do it in a very uncritical, unnuanced way. And it's probably just my own bias towards that, because I tend to be a lot more eye-rolly when I see bad criticism of news media, because I'm so used to it being rather half-baked. Like I said, the ideas are there. It's just they're not really hooking into something that feels rather well told or interesting or kind of socially relevant. And I think that goes on to another problem I have. One of my biggest issues with this is not the media stuff, it's not the bad metaphor, it's that there's a lot talking, a lot of exposition. Characters just talk about everything that's happening, and it's so overdone and it's so boring. By the time Simon Pegg's doing this big, massive speech, I was so tuned out. I just do not care anymore. And I think there's just too much that they tried to develop into this one script. And it feels like growing pains, because Doctor Who, the premise is they go into the world, and it's usually like the previous show was like 4 to 6 episodes. So usually they have like the first episode to build the world, but they don't have it with 45 minutes. And there's way too much for them to try to build into this. It just doesn't work, because it's either too much for the timeline to happen, or it's just not interesting enough for an entire story as it is.
And let me suggest this before I let Lucy make her point. Like, I think part of the problem is Adam, and the fact that like there's just too many ideas in this episode for it to also be like this little like experimental, what if we brought on a sort of fake companion from one episode thing.
And it feels like the growing pains thing. And this is something that they did way better with something like Jack, where he just kind of, he came in but he worked well the group's dynamic.
Jack is like integral to the plot of that story.
Yeah.
What I will say about Adam is that he's not really supposed to work with Nine and Rose, because I think the whole point is that he's supposed to be not cut out.
They try to act like he does work with them. Nine seems really angry at his betrayal and stuff like that.
All I was going to say is America Media is like a parody at this point, like Fox News and America One News, I think it's called. It's literally like a parody, so I could understand like Russell being like that.
Part of the thing with with like the whole advancement has been stalled by 90 years that Nine brings up, and is another thing of like we should have focused on this a bit more, is that it doesn't make any sense to, like, as technology advances, make journalism more dependent on the human element as opposed to less. Like, that's an interesting thing that I thought about, and then Nine brings it up, is like, why would they have like this little door that opens and closes in your head? That doesn't make any sense. That's not an efficient way to do the news, is to have it be reliant on human beings and the human brain. That's not how you would do that. You would make it more solely operated by machines.
Yeah, I think he didn't think it through because, like you said, it needs to be more accessible and stuff. I understand what he was trying to do, like, oh, we're held back because, you know, we are being brainwashed and going.
Yeah, well,
we see it today, even and stuff. But he focused on the wrong things. That's not what's going to hold us back.
That's one of the things where the episode did think it through, and it just doesn't come across great because of the way that we're not managing our time. Because the reason that we use humans, because they're what Max is going to eat, basically.
Mm-hmm. Also, how do we feel about Max? Me and my mom call him the butthole monster.
I think that he's supposed to be... I get what they're going for. I think he's supposed to be a sort of parody of Rupert Murdoch. That's how I interpreted it. But as a villain, he's incredibly terrible. It's literally just a blob on the ceiling who growls. Apparently Simon Pegg listens to this thing too, just literally talks to it. Like, it's just stupid. It also looks terrible. It's aged badly. It literally just looks like CGI. Its motivations are just sort of thrown together in some like 3-second exposition line. Then it just gets blown up. I'd say probably the worst villain of the series. Has to be, right? Series 1. Not the whole show, but like Series 1 for sure.
It's a tie between this or the farting aliens, because they were also, even putting the farting aside, they're just very over the top.
The moments, whereas this was just a thing.
Slitheen had some good lines.
When they're not farting, I actually think the Slitheen are quite decent.
You could argue that the Slitheen also get the benefit of get to be in like 3 full episodes, and their initial 2-parter is very heavy on the fart jokes, but when we get to Boomtown, we're less reliant on that, and we're actually like fleshing out that character. But I do get where Lucy's coming from, where at least as far as Aliens of London and World War III go, I'd say that the Slitheen and Max are the only villains that make their episodes worse. For the Slitheen, it is the constant farting. And for Max, it's like, I can see sort of how it would seem like a good idea on like a metaphorical level as to the idea of like corrupt news media can be traced back to like corrupt individuals who are almost literally like this ravenous, mindless beast. And that's an interesting idea. And other episodes will do similar things that don't bother me as much. Part of my distaste for this episode is just that there's a lot of interesting ideas here, and I feel like it's really undermined by the fact that it's all in service of a big pink blob. Not too silly, but like Dan alluded to with the lack of personality, like it's just a generic mindless monster that just like growls, roars, and does nothing.
The fact that it is a blob isn't actually the main problem. Like if you watch the Tom Baker story, Horror of Fang Rock, the villain who's going around killing people is literally just a tiny jellyfish-like blob thing, but it actually has sort of a personality to it and a backstory, so it sort of works better. Whereas this is literally, as you said, thing on the ceiling going rah 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 rah.
Because we try to have him like speak through the editor, who I would argue is a waste of Simon Pegg.
Absolutely.
It's series 1. You don't know how successful your show is going to be. They're like, if we can get Simon Pegg, let's get him while we can.
Sure, Simon Pegg wasn't objecting, to be fair.
Yeah. It's like, it's just such a shame because like I'd love to have him be like a major role or even like a villain again in a more modern episode. The editor isn't terrible. And like Simon Pegg is, you know, he's giving a performance, but he's just kind of there to be the mouthpiece to this thing when it's like, really, why did these even have to be 2 separate characters? Why couldn't we have one thing that has a personality?
Just the idea that Doctor Who can do kind of these generic monsters really fun is The Green Death, which is one of my favorite John Pertwee stories, has a supercomputer as a villain. And they're usually just so boring and overly logical, but he's so much fun and he has this kind of weird, kind of charming, snooty personality, which makes him way more entertaining. And they could have done something similar to the editor, not just make him a rah-rah monster, like you said. It felt more like, to me, like the idea, like you said, of this ginormous blob eating at information from people and needing that to survive is an interesting metaphor, but it should have been somewhat combined into Peg's character, and it feels more like kind of growing pains of the show where they felt like they needed to have this giant kind of rah monster for the episode, rather than just kind of trusting that the audience would be interested and compelled by a human villain like Peg. Because the idea of humans using information selfishly and reckless is one of the major themes of the episode. If your main villain was just using this information for his own selfish, nefarious ways, and not just feeding a giant blob ceiling monster, that would have been a little bit more cohesive and would have been a better parallel to the Atom stuff. As it stands, it's just too many cooks in the kind of weird, I'm not going to say ceiling monster again.
Max.
Russell T. Davies named 2 of his villains Max.
I noticed that this is an issue in the Russell era way more than in the Moffat or Chibnall eras, where every episode has to have a creature of some kind, or it's like Russell trying to make the show as marketable as possible, where every week we have to have, in a major role of some kind, a like really alien looking design, whereas Moffat and Chibnall will they'll have creatures, but they'll be way more content to let humans or humanoid figures be the majority cast.
Yep.
In a story.
Watching during the Hinchcliffe years where it was more horror focused, so I think the idea ingrained into their heads is that every Doctor Who episode has to have a monster, because Doctor Who is the show about monsters, when it really isn't. Several stories in the 1960s which didn't have that. It was only really, I think, like the Hinchcliffe years really where they've started to go like every story has a sort of monster or alien in it. And that's sort of what the show became really since then. They have to shoehorn a monster into literally everything. Like The Woman Who Lived is probably the worst example.
Yeah, you're
terrible
right.
Lion thing which breathed fire, and I think his name was Lenny or something, or what?
I will also say that it's interesting you bring out a point of Russell T. Davies needing to cram a monster into every episode, because one of his most celebrated episode, you don't see the monster at all. Rose seems to have a non-presence in the story outside of being a contrast to what the good companion is. Her contributions to the story are so minimal. 9 calling Adam her boyfriend was really annoying to me, and he does it a lot. I don't know why it was weird. I think I said before, Davies was very good at writing supporting characters, but none of the characters leave any impression whatsoever.
Who turned out to be a secret agent or something.
Yeah, that was so
pointless. I think even hinting at it.
The only person I can think has a little bit of that interests me a little bit was the nurse who operated on Adam, because some of her delivery was kind of funny.
She's a pretty well-known actress, is she not? She was in. I've not seen her in anything, but I know she's a big name, or at least was a big name back then.
I will say that actress gave that role way more weight than it ever would have on paper.
And how stupid it is that, like, he sends a message home through time, and we visualize his phone message with like blue electricity around the answering machine. That's just such a little stupid thing that I hate.
How does he think he's going to decipher that when he gets home?
I'm gonna keep the brain thing with him so he can use that to decipher the message.
A lot of these plot points are not very well fleshed out enough.
I think one of my favorite things about the visuals of the white light around the phone is that I said when we watched End of the World that the effects hold up really well for 2005. They don't look that terrible. They've aged somewhat well. Not so much for this story, so it does feel like they were running out of money for the budget. They could have saved a lot of money by just filming it as a phone and using weird noises. What's the point with the lights?
In Love and Monsters, where Elton is like, the internet had a meltdown and his desktop literally explodes.
The internet literally exploded. And to be fair, you can excuse that as unreliable narration, but it's still strange.
I choose to look at it that way in that episode, but I think what this all points to is that Russell just doesn't know how computers and phones work.
He comes across that way.
He just thinks they're going to blow up at any minute if he puts the wrong Twitter post up.
About with the ending and like 9 feeling a sense of betrayal, I actually think that's really interesting, and like the way that they handle it is interesting. I don't even know how much that's betrayal so much as it is, even with Rose, like 9 kind of assumes the worst of a lot of humans.
They do this in Father's Day, literally the next episode. Episode was sort of setting it up for Father's Day.
I think it is.
Felt a sense of betrayal by Rose, and he says in that episode he attacks like humans in that too.
He's explicitly building to Father's Day. The line that we end with where he's like, I only take the best, I have Rose. That used to really bother me because it felt like Russell like filleting Rose and like praising her because she's the creator's pet. And it could still very well be that. But in the context of knowing that like what happens next is Father's Day, that's very much like intentional setup. Okay, Rose is a person that Nine actually has faith in, and she's about to basically do what Adam did in this episode, but worse. Again, an interesting thing of like self-advancement. He sees an opportunity to use this technology to further himself, and he's like really selfish about it. And I think even more so than just that, what stuck out to me on this watch is that like it's because of Adam that the editor finds out that the Doctor is a Time Lord and like all of his backstory. I think Nine is specifically mad at Adam, intentionally or not, divulging his personal information. And so like on top of everything else, he's like, because of you, someone who would have otherwise known nothing about me now knows all of my personal baggage. I gotta get rid of you. You cannot be trusted. You know too much. Get out.
Okay, I understand the execution of that, but are you telling me that in between Dalek and the Long Game, the Doctor basically exposited his whole backstory to Adam?
It's been a while since I watched Dalek. Did he not find out over the course of that episode?
No.
Was that not like in like the Doctor's exchanges with the Dalek?
No. At the end of the episode, he walks into the TARDIS while saying, "Wait, what are you doing walking inside this box?"
Adam is there for scenes where the Doctor and the Dalek are like talking to each other, and the Time War and like being a Time Lord comes up during that. They're all in the room, and the Dalek is like on the monitor, and he and the Doctor are going back and forth.
Down in the basement with Rose.
I don't know. I'm trying to give this episode credit because I don't remember everything that happened with him and Dalek, but I don't know.
And like, it's very strange to me that Adam would seemingly know all about the Doctor with the little amount of time he's spent with him.
I also like that it takes him like a million years to actually apologize, and that's part of the problem. Because like when the Doctor's stalking towards him, he starts by saying like, everything's fine, right? Like it all worked out in the end. And then he tries to like divert, and then he's like, well, technically it was your fault because you're in charge. He has like a good amount of time to just say, I screwed up, I'm sorry. And he doesn't until it's too late.
Overall on Adam, I will say, I'm kind of in two minds of the whole thing. On the one hand, he is the most interesting thing about the episode because it's incredibly unique to the show, to Russell T Davies to literally just throw this character in here and basically say, this guy cannot travel with the Doctor. You know, he's not cut out for this sort of life. So he just gets dumped after one story. It's very unique. Unfortunately, they really should have fleshed out Adam more as a character. I realize that the whole point of him is that he's supposed to be stupid and a bit of a douchebag, but that's basically all there is to his character. He's in the series for 2 full stories. I just don't think they fleshed him out beyond that. Oh, he's a guy who like considers himself a genius, actually a bit of a moron because he's incredibly selfish, and then the Doctor just dumps him back on Earth. That's basically his whole character. I don't think he gets fleshed out more than that whatsoever.
I didn't need to see his frozen vomit.
What's the point of having frozen vomit being put into the brain thing?
That's literally like a minute of screen time that you could have used on anything else.
It's like nothing else is important in this episode, but we need to have that frozen vomit in there.
Is it, you know what? Is it supposed to be that like Adam's gonna vomit because he's a weenie and like vomiting at like grotesque imagery isn't something that a cool companion would do, but we can't actually show the vomit on screen because family show, so we gotta freeze it into like a block of ice.
Russell had a really weird idea and had nowhere to put it and just said, okay.
The early bits of the Russell T Davies era is that he's clearly trying to appeal to everybody. How will this show not succeed if I don't appeal to this demographic, that demographic? So he's basically throwing in childish jokes in one episode to appeal to kids. And then he's on the other side, he's throwing in serious political commentary. It was like what you said earlier about the episode trying to do different things. And it was the same with the Slitheen story. It's sort of a mix of like, political commentary, also fart jokes, which the kids will like.
The first block that was shot, the pilot and the Aliens 2-parter. And you can really see by then that they did not know what tone they wanted to go with this show right yet. And it's something that they developed as it went on, but you can see a lot of the wrinkling issues with this story as well, where we have a lot of, like you said, a lot of weird, serious political stuff on top of really silly, dumb, childish jokes.
A lot of people do feel that the direction is actually the main problem with those. Both of those stories were directed by Keith Boak, and they contain many people consider to be the silliest moments of the new series, which are the burping wheelie bin scene and the farting scenes. Both of them also have like cartoonish sound effects, which you hear in like kids shows. And that director never worked for the show again, I noticed. And it's also rumored that he was the director Freckleston got into that bust-up with, too, because he treated the cast terribly. There's no confirmation of it, but all we know is that Christopher Eccleston didn't get along with a particular director who was abusive towards the cast. And that director never worked for the show again, unlike many of the other directors who appeared in this series.
I heard that, director also had no clue how to, like, make this show, and I haven't heard about the abuse stuff. That stuff's new to me. They potentially allegedly abusive stuff. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think you hit on the point. My problem with Adam is that he feels like he was written as an idea of, let's have this companion to the first series to show that not everyone can travel with the Doctor, but they didn't really develop him beyond that. So he tends to just kind of flip-flop to whatever the scene needs him to be. In one scene, he's a dumb guy who faints and he's comedic. In another scene, he's devious and manipulative, and then he's pathetic. And you can create a character out of this. My issue with him not gelling with Rose and the Doctor is more that his betrayal doesn't feel as impactful, because I really don't feel like these two really give a crap about him. And in fairness, I think the one thing I will say about this is that no matter how boring these episodes can be, Eccleston always gives it his game. He's great in the final scene. You could really feel his anger at this pathetic little man trying to give him excuses after he betrayed him. It would have been a bit more impact if Adam was more of a character, and like he gets his own little subplot and they give him so much screen time, and I just do not care at all. I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop and for this to end. And that could have been a lot of screen time. We could have been building this really convoluted little world that Russell T Davies is trying to set up and make the story be a bit more streamlined. A lot of the tension is built on this dude with his stupid ass plan. And I just kind of check out.
I think one of the main problems with it is that Rose basically stops caring about Adam. Like, initially when she invited him aboard the TARDIS, she invited him on because she sort of had a crush on him or whatever. Yeah. I think that was supposed to be it. But at the beginning of the episode, Adam faints. Doctor says, mocks her by saying, he's your boyfriend. And she says, not anymore. And then she just treats him like complete crap for the rest of the episode. And then just doesn't care at all when they abandon him at the end. She just literally walks out smiling like, ha, you just got abandoned.
I just wanted to bring up that scene where they're going up the elevator and they're just like, it's just the two of us, and they just hold hands and get real flirty and like,
They hold hands while the door's closing, and it's a bit much. My final point on Adam is that you're not worthy of Adric's lapel, sir.
Oof. What I will say about Adam is they actually brought him back in a 50th anniversary comic book, I think, which I've never read because it's Adam. I just can't be bothered. But at the 50th anniversary, they did a multi-Doctor sort of special where Adam Mitchell, to get revenge on the Doctor, kidnapped every single incarnation of the Doctor and their companions for some crazy scheme. I just want to get that out there in case you're interested in the resolution to the story of Adam Mitchell.
So the universe will be destroyed by Adam.
A bit at the very, very end where his mom snaps his fingers is so vaudeville comedy. It's a bit... It's
just kind of really dark. Like, the Doctor warned them that these people are going to experiment, tear him apart. He reveals himself, so we don't know what happens after.
Like, if Adam wasn't such a massive turd, that would be a really dark thing. The Doctor just basically tortures this guy for the rest of his life, and he's really young, so, like, another 40, 50 years or so, just hiding from society.
I'm sure he could convince his mom to, like, stay quiet about it.
It just comes across like an episode of Grisly Tales for Gruesome Kids. Like, this is Adam's fate for the rest of his life because he committed a bad deed.
It doesn't really hit that well because the episode's too boring and stupid to have any impact. But
like, my final thoughts are just that this is an episode with a lot of good ideas, but I think its biggest problem really is what Dan said, which is that it's very talking heads. It's just constant exposition. I think maybe it could have benefited from being a two-parter where you could spread the exposition out and maybe find ways to bring more action into it. It's just not the most compelling watch. It's got a lot of interesting things to talk about. It doesn't convey those things in the best way. It doesn't use its time in the best way, and it's not really that engaging. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, I basically have the same opinion. It has some interesting ideas, so I do think there's some work there, but mostly it's just pretty boring, and the villain's the worst part because it's literally just a butthole.
Nah.
This is a strange episode because on paper, this sounds like it should be a great episode. It's got some interesting, unique things that the show hasn't really done before, like the media manipulation and the companion who failed and all that. It is kind of interesting in parts, but in terms of like dialogue, the characters themselves, including the main cast, who aren't really used well either, just how overall it's juggling too much and none of them really get enough screen time. It's just, yeah, very uninteresting episode. I'd say maybe not my absolute least favorite of series 1. It's close. It's just, there's just not much to it. I admire it for trying to do different things, which is probably why I don't consider it the worst of series 1, but it's just rather mediocre. A really sort of uninteresting execution of all these ideas. There's just not much to talk about.
I think I said in our group chat that it's bad Doctor Who, but it's bad Doctor Who in a way that's boring, so it's not actually that interesting to talk about. Most of you guys have said the points I was going to bring up, like it's very expository without really showing us this world or developing it in a really interesting way that's a bit more engaged. Main cast are particularly underused, no matter how well Christopher Eccleston just knocks out the party. I think he's really given. He's just a really great workhorse of an actor. It's focused a lot on a character that has no real personality beyond the idea of him being a bad companion. It's a total waste of Simon Pegg. Most of the supporting cast are really dull as well. The villain, again, like I said, there's a lot of interesting areas you can go with the media satire. If they had managed to flesh it out in a way that was a bit more coherent or focused, it would have been a really interesting take and relevant both in 2005 and 2020. But as it stands, it's just kind of a mediocre mess with too much ideas kind of in the broth and nothing really spectacular comes out of it.
Yes, I think we talked everything we can about this episode.